Mostert's mill was the last remaining working windmill on the continent. The iconic mill was about to celebrate its 225th milestone when tragedy struck 2 years ago. The windmill was damaged in a runaway mountain fire that started atop Devil's Peak slopes. Since then, it has, at the foot of the mountains of UCT, undergone massive renovations. According to volunteers, it'll be a matter of weeks before this iconic property is restored to its former glory. Newzroom Afrika's Natalie Malgas joins us live. Natalie, I don't see any arms on the windmill, but it is certainly looking in better nick than it was after those raging veld fires. Tell us more.
Well, Erin, those sales are going to go up in the next couple of weeks. I'm actually standing with the chairperson of Friends of Mostert's Mill, and in a bit we'll get into just how significant and unique this iconic structure is. As you mentioned, it was unfortunately caught in that fire about 2 years ago, along with a few other really iconic structures along this M3 strip here, the stretch of the highway at the foot of UCT, as you mentioned. But in the next few months, at least, in fact, we were chatting a little off air with John Hammer from Friends of Mostert's Mill, saying that work has been happening tirelessly over the last 2 years. John, let's start with how significant and unique this mill is. How special is it really?
Yeah, Mostert's Mill is a very unique, special mill because it's more than 200 years old. It was built on this farm, Velgelegen, over here. And it's a little farm mill, and the last remaining working windmill in Africa. It was restored in '95, and I've been involved since then, and we have worked it every month for the last 27 years. And then the fire came along and took that all away from me. So next job now is to rebuild it, and once more we'll have people visiting the mill when it's working. The sales will be going round and round. We'll be grinding wheat into meal, and we'll have it up and running again within the next 4 months or so.
Let's talk a bit about that fire 2 years ago. What was the extent of the damage to the mill, and was there any silver lining after that tragedy?
Yeah, once the spark got into the thatching over there, all the machinery inside the mill was wooden machinery, some of it old ship's timbers, and obviously the whole lot of that burnt. All that was left was a little pile of ashes from those whole huge big pieces of machinery. But the metal work was blacksmith's work from 200 years ago, and we saved that. The day after the fire, we were already here, saving the metal raking the metal out of the fire. We got a structural engineer to come and have a look at the building itself, and it actually, it was originally built in 1796 of sun-baked bricks. So the fire was like a kiln inside there. It's actually baked those bricks and made the building harder. There were some big cracks that had to be filled in, but the structure was still sound enough. And when we found that out, we decided, let's go ahead and start rebuilding the machinery inside the mill.
We have spotted some of the sails lying around the windmill. What happens next? How much work is still left before it all gets operational again?
So the next job, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, there's going to be a mobile crane coming, and it's going to lift the sails up, and you'll see in the picture there's a wind shaft attached to the sails. That whole lot's going to be lifted up and put into the mill, so once more it'll have sails and it'll look like a windmill. At the moment it's a tower. One has to remember that it's a windmill, so the whole roof has to be able to rotate around into the wind. So the first big job was to get that rotating roof in place. And then the thatchers came along and thatched it. So if the wind is blowing from the northwest, it's no good having the mill facing the south. So it's a complicated structure. It's wood sliding on wood to bring the whole, it's called winding the cap, and that brings the sails into the wind.
What's the hope when everything is operational again? What would you like to see happen? How embedded is this windmill in the community of Cape Town?
Yeah, as lots of people come to the mill and say they came here as children, as we said earlier. It's an iconic building, and the fact that it works, it's one of 3 in the southern hemisphere that's working, is the important part about it. So my job is to show people how a windmill works when they come to visit. You come to the gate, you join as a friend of Mostert's Mill, and you get a good hour's tour, and you see how an ancient windmill works. And then the other job is to train the next generation of millers. Not anyone can come to this mill and actually start milling. It requires a skill. When the mill was restored, we had an old Dutch miller come here and teach 3 of us. I'm the only one left that has, but I've handed the skill on to 4 or 5 other people already. And my big hope is that after everything is up and running again, we'll have a lot of volunteers coming and say, please, can I learn how to be a windmiller?
Is there a rush to get, is there a time stamp to all of this when you want everything back up and running and the gates open to the public again?
We did think that we were rather hoping that we'd do it on the second anniversary of the fire, which would have been, it was 18th of April 2023. But we're still away from getting to that end, and there's no rush to get to the end of it. It's been here for 200 years, it's not going anywhere. We're all doing it as a part-time job. It's not a full-time job for any of us that are busy with the restoration. So we're doing it bit by bit, and when we get there, we'll get there. So I reckon there's another 4 months worth of work to do.
Would you say that this is a passion project for all the volunteers involved to get it all up and running and restored to its former glory?
Yes, it's definitely. They're not all volunteers. Some of us are volunteers and others are being paid for their skills. We decided early on, don't make it all volunteers because then there's no comeback. We can't put them under pressure. So the craftsmen that are busy making the bits of machinery are being paid for that. There's a number of us that are volunteers. We don't get a cent out of it.
Thank you so much, John. Erin, as you heard from John Hammer of Friends of Mostert's Mill, this is a passion project for just about everyone involved, whether they're being paid for it or not, because this iconic structure, more than 200 years old, is so embedded in the Cape Town community and particularly the stretch of the southern suburbs. There's a great deal of history on these grounds, and restoring it to its former glory is what the end goal is here.
Natalie, first off, I'm glad that you could inform us that it's sails, not arms, that are going to be added to that structure. And also, if you could please organise a nice bag of that first flour that gets ground up in the mill and send it to the Joburg office. We'd all love to give it a good try. But before you go, Natalie, just looking around the site, you obviously were present when those Cape Town fires happened. How much visible damage is still there, or have things really sort of revived altogether?
For most of the stretch that was impacted by the fire, including the UCT premises and the grounds that we're standing on right now, things are looking pretty back to normal with a lot of work. As John was saying a little earlier, everyone basically kicked into gear from the very next day. We were on campus at UCT when we saw the library, that African Studies library, completely destroyed, and several of the structures on the upper campus affected by, of course, Rhodes Memorial too, affected by that fire. Since then, there's been a ton of work that's gone into it. Of course, a lot of money too to restore these historic buildings. And for the most part, things look pretty normal at the moment. But as we know from the mill and other parts of the UCT campus and, of course, Rhodes Memorial, there are still one or two things that need to happen before we can say things are totally back to normal and as they were before the fire 2 years ago.
Natalie Malgas there for us in the Western Cape at Mostert's Mill.